peace, blessings, and elevation. We will bring you inspiring stories, expert insight, and practical tools and information to support you. Stereotypes and embracing our authentic selves, we can pave the way for a brighter future for ourselves and our children. Empower, heal, and support fathers and men on their journey. I'm your host, Kelly Little, aka the Village King. Welcome to the Father's Haven. Family, welcome back to another powerful episode of the Father's Haven podcast, where we build brave spaces for men to reflect, heal, lead, and legacy build. I'm your host, Kelly R. Little, and today we are honored to welcome a scholar, a researcher whose work in reshaping how we understand fatherhood, absence, presence, and identity. Our guest today, Dr. Mathew Alemu, PhD, a nationally recognized researcher, a scholar, a father, a son, who completed his doctorate in the joint sociology and public policy program at the University of Michigan. His groundbreaking work examines one of the most important questions of our time. How does experiencing an absent father shape the life course or continuum of young Black men? Dr. Alemu's dissertation dives deep into how father absences influences young Black men's ideologies, intentions for fatherhood, and approaches to romantic relationships. And he brings a lens that is analytical, empathetic, and culturally grounded. Before entering academia, Doc served as a policy analyst for the Government Accountability Office, and he holds an MPP from the University of Michigan and a BS in accounting from Xavier University of Louisiana. Beyond the academy, he is a committed public scholar with op-eds featured in outlets like Detroit Free Press, Bridget Detroit, and Blavidity.com. This amazing and beloved brother family didn't just study fatherhood. He illuminates the stories. He challenges the way we look at systems and the human truths behind it. Today, we explore his latest publication. Not going to dig into that just yet, but he's going to talk about what it means to be striving to presence, purpose, and generational healing. And the other thing I need y'all to know is that Dr. Alemu is another fellow brethren from the great city of Philadelphia, aka the city of brotherly love. Welcome to the Father's Haven, and we're going to start today's episode off with one of our featured questions, which is, what is your superpower as a man, a scholar, a researcher, a son, and how did that shape your journey in this thing we call life that's always life?
No, I appreciate the introduction and for inviting me into the space. Superpower question, I think that, plays out both in my research, but, also as a father, it's a bit twofold. I think I've always been good at asking a lot of questions, probably too many for most people, but I think I'm equally good at also listening to people's responses. So, when I sat down with the men for my research, I was great at getting questions that allowed them to tell their story in their terms. And writing about them, reflects, I think, how hard and intently I listened to everything they had to say. My daughter will say the same. I probably ask her too many questions. I think sometimes she avoids me telling me things because she knows I'm going to have a million questions. But I think those represent my biggest superpower.
Love that answer. And, we talked about belonging, community, and when you look at it and talking about asking questions in particular for communities and people in this conversation being the fathers who may have felt like they are never heard or never seen, as you ask those questions and allow to move beyond symptomology and get into the root of what problems were, in your opinion, how did that allow you to bring to the surface some of the difficulties as it relates to fatherhood to the conversation? And How comfortable would you say that the men and fathers were?
I think I made them comfortable in the one-on-one conversation, but I do think the discomfort is probably more present in the fact that, as a community, especially I think for a lot of men, I don't think they're used to having these conversations. Almost all the men I would talk to, they would start talking about their dad, about their feelings about their absent dad, and would say things like, I've never talked about this with anyone. And for a lot of them said, I don't feel comfortable. For some of them, it's like, I don't want to stress my mom out with questions about my dad. Um, or they're just too angry and don't want to think about it. So um, I think having a space that feels safe and kind of siloed from other people allows them, I think, to just really get in touch with feelings and memories they haven't had to really think about.
So that's so deep in that one of my areas of specialty is having conversations around emotional intelligence. And as men and fathers, we often hear that women are too emotional.
Hmm.
And as I've unpackaged a lot of things, what I noticed that the majority of my brothers sometimes when we really sit down and have conversations and discussions or at the barbershop, we're just as emotional, if not more emotional, if we think of some of the issues that plague our communities. Many times I would suggest that it could be a result of a lack there of processing through emotions, right? And when we think of a Coke bottle or a Pepsi bottle, you shake it up. You ain't gonna open the top because it's gonna spew.
Yeah.
But what we often forget is if I don't open it, that same bottle that I shook up that can't explode is still going to expand
Mm.
and could potentially implode depending on the pressure. So as you were doing your research um, and your dissertation, matter of fact, can you unpackage a little bit about your dissertation first, and then I'll go back to the question.
Yeah, yeah. So, when I started grad school, my initial interest was always in Black men. Um, and when I first started, I was always interested in kind of how they use their kind of upbringing experiences um, to shape how they thought about the world, right? So work, relationships, whatever have you. Um, but early in the work, when I would interview men about their childhoods, I wasn't surprised by the way that men started talking about their absent fathers. Although I wasn't expecting as many men as I interviewed um, to have an absent father, but what stuck out the most was that they were all very different stories, right? It wasn't like everyone was telling the same type of absent father story. And, I had myself, I think, neglected the value of really thinking about how one consequence of not talking about these things enough is also, I think, oversimplifying how kind of complex each of our stories are, right? Like five men with absent fathers could sit in the same barbershop, like you said, but each have a different way in which they experience the absence, right? And how you experience it is going to have impact on how you process it, how you process who your father is, how you process being a dad yourself, how you process relationships. But the opportunity for that has been muted because men don't often engage in that conversation to really understand those differences, right? And to be honest, a lot of this work was inspired, by my own upbringing and experiences with the same. When I started this work, I realized the same thing that I hadn't talked about this with any of my friends. And at the same time, I can't tell you any friends I saw growing up where I even met their father. I know
Mm.
all my friends' moms. I can't tell you one, maybe one like father I saw of a friend growing up in Philly. Um, and so it was as illuminating for myself and processing my own story as it was, I think, to hear these men's stories.
Wow, that's deep. Because the question that I was initially going to ask you was, did the research and that process cause you to revisit some of your own stories? And so, what out of that surprised you in an unexpected way? What came up unexpectedly for you?
So I got to backtrack a bit then. So I started grad school in 2012. About 7 years prior in '05, I met my father. Um, uh, Summer 25, I was 20 years old, and I hadn't seen my father in about 15 years. And I, when I left Philly, went to undergrad, it was kind of the first time in colleges where I saw like I actually saw fathers, right? I saw fathers bringing their kids to school, moving them in. Even if the fathers weren't, residential, they were still in their kids' lives, and I just hadn't seen that. And so I think seeing more of that in college really caused me to realize that I had something that I needed to reconcile. And
Mm-hmm.
so near the end of my undergrad time, I reached out to my father to try to, arrange a meeting. So like I said, it'd been almost 15 years. And so we finally met that summer. And prior to the meeting, I just had anger, right? I was upset. I felt abandoned. I felt neglected. And I just had all this anger that I don't know if I wanted him to validate it or apologize. But I knew I was angry. And when we met, it was a very interesting kind of a thing took place. So I sit there. I don't recognize him. So that was like the first thing that I had this memory of him as a 5-year-old that didn't look the same at 20. So I was
Mm-hmm.
making sense of how different he looked. But, what was interesting is what he started telling me that I never thought about. So, he started sharing about how, all this time that he was unemployed and, couldn't afford to pay child support and all these stories that were very different from my mom's stories. But the most kind of like meaningful thing he told me was that he talked about missing me, that on my birthday he would like light a candle for me every year. And all the time he was gone and all the anger I had, I could never imagine him missing me. And so I'm sitting here listening to this person I've held all this anger at, and a few things happen. One, I'll say one, he never fully took responsibility for his absence, but at the same time, I also recognize that I didn't really know who he was. That almost everything I felt and everything I knew was really what my mom and her family told me. And I remember that day, like leaving there, thinking like I didn't have my own anger. And
Mm-hmm.
so that really started a process, I think, of me just thinking more critically about um, both who my father is, but also um, like kind of who informed what I knew about my father, right? And so um, that realization became really critical in the research because one, um, as I started listening to more stories and started hearing other people talk, I also started to kind of situate my experience, right? So I hadn't seen my father in 15 years, but there's many non-resident fathers that see their kids every week. And so one mistake I had made and one thing that I had to reconcile was that my experience wasn't the norm, right? That there were many people and many absent fathers who see their kids very regularly, who are very present. And I didn't even realize that was a possibility. So kind of like situating my story among other people's stories was really helpful. I think both for me, but I think also for scholarship, right? That I think too often we assume um to um to a fault that absent fathers never see their kids, right? And this work I think really highlights that when you think about the variety of ways that people experience absence, right? All absent fathers aren't absent. Um, and I think that's something that's really critical and something that really, helped me in terms of reconciling my own experience, but also better humanizing other people's experiences. And I think one thing that policymakers get wrong is operating from a very narrow definition of absence. Um, but the second part that I think is really critical is, this idea of like who my father was, right? Like I said, I mostly held my mom's feelings and my family's feelings about him. And they were justified. I'm not saying their feelings weren't justified, but they weren't mine, right? That I was mad at my dad for my mom versus being angry at my dad because it was my anger. And that really played out when I would hear different men's stories and realize that you had some men who had control of their narrative of their dad, right? Like they knew who their dad was because they interacted with him. But then you had a lot of men who were similar to me that knew what someone else told them about their dad. And that's what they were operating from, right? So there's some men telling me these stories about who their dad is, his character, his ambitions, his feelings that really is someone else's opinions and ideas about, but not their actual fathers. And so in that sense, I think two people really suffer there, right? Like the son who's experiencing absence and the absent father who can't speak for himself. And now mind you, I'm not saying my absent dad was a good person. I've learned he's not, but at least I've learned it on my terms, right? It's my story to tell. It's my experience to tell versus taking ownership of someone else's story. And I think for a lot of men, um, I think, and even like myself, right? I think you neglect the obstacles that these fathers face, right? Being absent still hurt me, but to be able to also humanize my father and realize like, oh, you have these legitimate structural obstacles, finding employment, child support, problematic child support visitation system that we all know um, can make it even harder for fathers to see their kids, things I could never fully appreciate. Um, that, I gained in that meeting with him, but also gained even more systematically from hearing these men's stories and thinking about the consequences of kind of these myths that men end up building about their own fathers who they don't really know.
So here's what I love what you just shared, right? Because one of the things that one of the other things you and I share is same thing. I grew up in a house with my mother, my sister, my cousins, all women.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
one of the nuances or differences, I've never seen mine, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the difference is I've never heard any negative stories either, right? But we both served in shared space with men who carry almost like Atlas, the weight of the world in terms of beliefs on what they're supposed to be, maybe took some hostility or animosity, or they get four different stories of who their father was,
Mm-hmm.
but and all that gets packaged on them, and they never did what you did, which is to get to a point where you can actually grab the real story. You had a chance to have conversation and to see, right? And so not being able, or I'm not saying not being able to, not just moving with one narrative and being able to discern based on your own observation. And then two, this conversation around a word that I know, and I would ask you to unpackage it a little bit in a little bit. A lot of fathers will use the term father because they can't stand absent parent, non-custodial parent,
Yeah.
and residential parent, right? And so in your research, what are some of the things that came up about these titles that have been imposed on them by systems and institutions when, to your point, I could be in a home, a biological father, and be present physically
Mm-hmm.
and have no presence literally? Can you talk a little bit about some of the things that you've explored, both from your experience in navigating and interacting and engaging with the dads and fathers who you've done the research on, but then also what has been illuminating pieces of information that you gathered to inform the field better as a result of your own awareness to these things and your own experience.
So I think so on one end, right, I think it's important that we appreciate um right that even being physically in the house, being part of the house, um, you know, doesn't make you present, right? And in some cases I interviewed men, I interviewed two. I had two respondents whose fathers actually migrated back and forth for work between Mexico and South America and Michigan. And in both those instances, the fathers were residents, right? They never absconded from the house. They just had to leave for work. And in one case, actually, it wasn't that he didn't leave the state. He literally worked so much that every time the kid woke up, the dad was already at work. And when he went to
Mm-hmm.
sleep, he was still at work. So he really just saw his dad on the weekends. Um, and so I think in those instances, right, in some ways you have almost what you could call like necessary absence, right? Like the men have to not be there to make the house function. Um, and so that's one type. But then you have men who are there all the time. They're always watching TV, playing games, whatever have you, and at no point interact with the kids, right? So I think even the ability to find better terminology to highlight all the different ways that fatherhood exists is critical. Um, my, stake in this though is the fact that we've really oversimplified um, how fathers are absent from the home to the extent that we assume that all fathers who are absent never see their kids. And so what I think I offer in the terminology I present, so patterned, unpatterned, extended and absolute. I think what they actually do a good job of doing is not necessarily just representing um, how absent the fathers were, but also how absent, the men I interviewed grew up with an absent father. So this also reflects how absent they felt their father was, right? So the terms are based off their descriptions, and I think it offers something helpful in terms of thinking about these physical patterns, but also, one of the biggest problems in research that we've often relied on mothers' testimonies about father visitation to classify absence. My typology comes from the men who experienced absence themselves, right? So it's bringing kind of the children's voice into this definition construction that both reflects how they felt, but I think also recognizes, right? Like I said, there were men who saw their fathers every week, um, but the dad was non-residential. So I think using language that better reflects the actual pattern of absence, I think is better than even an overgeneralized term like non-residential, because you can be non-residential in so many ways.
Mm-hmm.
And we tend to assume the worst when we say non-residential, right? Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, and I'm in my mind. I'm mind mapping like the titles, even down to the conversation around deadbeat fathers, and then where's the story really coming from,
Mhm.
right? I've heard even in the court system references be made, and so to me, sometimes I feel like we prioritize just the financial component of that relationship
Mhm.
over the time-based component, because kids, now again, don't get me wrong, I know we need to make sure we're supporting and doing our part, but in a lot of instances, and I spent many years in leadership in child support, and was one of the first, if not the first, to put fatherhood and child support in the entire country back in '09,
Mhm.
embedded in the office. And when I watch and listen and look at the interaction as moms were interacted with from a system and how the fathers was interacted with, they were distinctly different. Even although maybe not intentionally, but it comes from a system that was girded or undergirded in, okay, the the child support attorney gonna sit here, the mother gonna be over there, and I say the mother, but it's really the non-custodial parent, which is primarily the mom in most occasions. And then you watch the way implicit bias sits in sometime. But this conversation, the dead beat as opposed to dead broke on many occasions. While also, when I think dead broke, I think physically and mentally broke because they feel like they fight in the system. And sometimes child support might not have all the answers. And
Yeah.
it's just the stories who got to the system first. As you talk with some of the men, and so that takes me to like this thing around healing, intentionality, and manhood. We're often taught that men just man up. There's this ideal that men and fathers are not human, right? From the sense that how they just need to, okay, pay the support, but they're not in pain because of lack there of a relationship. Or an example you just gave a few minutes ago, some are providing, they're still in the home, but they
Mhm.
have to work to make ends meet just so that their family can have the things necessary, a roof over their head and other things. What was some of the conversation that you had from these men, the ones who wasn't in a home, so them moving from um really like pain to purpose, that transformation, but then the men who were actually in the home, how did they express how they felt about working so much that they had little time to spend with their significant other and their children or child?
Well, I can't fully speak to that. So, all the interviews were based around the men's fathers, right? So,
Okay.
um, so how their fathers dealt with that, I don't know.
Okay.
Um, but I do think it's something to be said around the fact that whatever these struggles may be, um, that in cases where you have a father who was never there or you rarely ever saw him, the inability to really appreciate that story, right? And I think what this really, speaks to is I think you have two really struggles happening that I think tends to be in conflict, right? You have the struggles of men as fathers, then you have the pain and abandonment of the kids experiencing an absence, right? And I think sometimes those stories are both so painful that they kind of talk past each other, right? So, like I said, I could never imagine that my dad was struggling with unemployment and child support. I just saw him as not being there,
Hmm.
right? And my pain was real, like abandonment's real, but his struggle to, meet those needs or find employment, pay rent, whatever it might be, is also real. And so I think for a lot of these men, I think what came up the most for the men that experienced more extreme absence was I would often think when talking to them, and sometimes they would even like kind of check themselves, they'd realize like they were making a lot of assumptions about their dad and his intentions and why he wasn't there, how he must have felt about them, right? And I think that represents how they felt as kids, and that's legit. But it doesn't necessarily reflect how their dad actually felt about them, what pain he experienced being absent. And I think what this research really speaks to the need is a way to better reconcile or um, you know, create a space to help both men heal from having an absent father, but help these absent fathers better connect with their kids in a way that kind of, bridges the pain of that absence on both sides. But I think too often, a lot of the men who never saw their dads just really build these assumptions or what other people told them, and that becomes their truth. And I think it blinds them to a lot of the experiences that Black men face generationally, right? The issues my dad faced, I can easily face, right? The issues I face, if I had a son, they could easily face. But if we're cut off from each other, right, we never even get to really think about us as part of this broader systemic problem that we've all faced across generations as Black men in this country.
Interesting, because the other thing is, you know, say trauma is passed down. So is it that trauma is passed down, or is it uh what I've experienced is being passed down, and I'm replicating the pain that I've experienced as a result of my father not being in my life. And so I don't go through that pain anymore. Sometimes that causes me not to have a relationship with my own child, if that makes any sense.
No, and that's actually what the last part of my research is trying to speak to is, when the title, better than my father, better than his absence. That was really me trying to get at this kind of tension between so I remember growing up, you probably heard it too, men that would say stuff like, my dad wasn't there, so I'm gonna be there. Right. But that's a very vague, ambiguous strategy, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
well intentioned. But what I noticed when the men would talk about, so when I would ask men about who grew up with an absent father, how they were going to be better fathers themselves, right? I saw these two camps of narrative. So you had the men who saw their fathers more regularly, even though they were non-residential, but they had very specific ways in which they were going to do something different than their dad, right? So it's like they lived with their dad at some point, maybe they went to the barbershop with their dad, or they saw their dad enough to know that, he wasn't always, he wasn't a good listener, whatever it might be, they had really specific ways to be different. And or things they liked and wanted to repeat. But the men who experienced more extreme absence, those are the men that relied on these kind of like really vague strategies. And in some ways were just like, I don't want my kid to feel the way I felt, right? But that's not a specific strategy, right? And if you don't know your dad wasn't there because he couldn't get a job, then you don't really know to incorporate, job training into part of your strategy as a father yourself. And so I think the men who are most disconnected from their absent fathers really suffer the most when trying to think about how to be different or be better or reduce that kind of traumatic repetition. Because all they're operating from is the fact that their father was absent, right? They don't know how to be categorically different than their dad.
So, ooh, what surprised you the most about their definitions of what better was for them?
Good question. I have this section in my dissertation. It's called it's basically this concept that you kind of sometimes make up who your father would have been
Mm-hmm.
when you don't know enough about him. And it was interesting how some of the men, even if whatever little they knew about their dad, they would still construct like these kind of like almost like false stories to be better than. So, case in point, this one guy was talking about How, his dad wasn't around. So, and none of these men I interviewed for my dissertation were fathers yet. So it's all about what they intended to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but so this one guy talked about how he was gonna, be there for his kids, and he was gonna teach them um, how to play baseball or basketball, one of them. Because he's like that's what his dad would have done if he were around more. But I was like, but you said earlier that your dad only played basketball, so how do you know he would have taught you baseball? And so sometimes the stories they create about their dad to kind of make up for what they don't know, and then kind of try to incorporate that into their own future strategies as father, I thought was interesting that men kind of create this tale that might be fictitious, might be partial reality. And I think they know they are to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's kind of like you're using like this imagined idea of your father versus who your father actually is. Um, to guide your future strategy as a father. And I just thought that was really profound for me that, you know, in lieu of actual memories about your dad, you have to make some up, right? And what that says about I think in some ways, right? I think men's determination to be different, right? That sometimes you got to make up a standard um to live by. And I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was really profound that, that you can see how bad these men want to be good fathers even if they have to make up who their own father was to be better than. Um, that really stood out to me the most. It's something actually I didn't even intend to write about that I ended up really focusing a lot on. I can't remember the title of it, but this idea of kind of making up who your father was, I thought was really interesting.
So when you think about that, I'm sure you knew that it was going to be a little difficult as you kind of walk down certain questions with those young men or fathers, whatever age they are, who had that barrier of not really having true relationship with dad or having some difficult thoughts. So how did you create like emotional safety for them to um even though they knew it was going to be difficult to be comfortable in sharing? And I asked that because I know you had to have something in play. There are going to be many people who may be listening who work with young men, elder men, because really we know that the brain, if you don't make it through a certain phase, your development is stopped as a result of not navigating down that pathway. So, how do we create the same safety that you provided when you were doing this dissertation and asking these questions so that, like in these programs, or we find it in the barbershop many times.
Yeah.
People can say what they want, but I tell people all the time, for women, the hair salon is a place full of therapists for women to a
Mm.
degree. I still would suggest that you get professional help, but it does allow you to relax. You in a chair, you're asking some difficult questions. I'm not going to answer those difficult questions unless you create an environment for me to feel comfortable enough to go down that path.
No, that's a great point. I think that it was funny, and there's a few times men in the interviews would almost, I think they would feel like they were in therapy. I haven't made it a point to stop. I wouldn't take notes, like obviously, because I think that would also make them think they were in therapy. Um, so I had this philosophy I built when I started these interviews. Like I've even myself, I've been interviewed for stuff, and sometimes I hate it when you kind of get bombarded with questions, and then you got to kind of like fit your story into the questions. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that kind of like interview, I think encourages men to either perform or not really tell you what they're like, just basically tell you what you want to answer the question the way you think they want them to. Um, and so the way I approached my interviews was that I kind of wanted to give them all the power to tell their story on their terms. And so I came with a lot of questions, obviously, but I always had two interviews and I always let them go as long as they needed to, because I would simply just ask the men, tell me about your life growing up. And then I would listen for how they talked about their father and their story. Um, Now, mind you, that meant that some interviews were 3 hours long. Most of my interviews on average are 2 hours. And I think that that kind of space, and also the fact they know that they were talking to someone who, like, I'm not going to tell their mom, I'm not going to tell their siblings. I think I offered this kind of like, escape, where they knew that what they said here wasn't going to get to no one else. And someone actually said that they're like, I know you're not going to tell anyone. Um, but I think that the fact that I just allowed men to talk, and I listened more than I spoke. Um, I think that's something I honestly just weren't used to. So I think the ability to get these men to tell their stories on their terms, I think is really pivotal. I also think sometimes, I think once you have that space, I think it's easier to create a barbershop setting when everyone's had the space to be personally vulnerable. And then I think it can be easier than be collectively vulnerable. Because I mean, you're right. Like in a barbershop, and I remember, when I used to go when I had hair, um, it's also kind of performative, right? It's like, it's competitive, it's friendly, but it's also not the easiest space to tell this really, sad story about your life. Um, and I think providing men this space to just feel heard and seen and validated, really is what, I think we need to consider, what that looks like in terms of policy. But a lot of men have a lot of stuff they just need to get off their chest. And a lot of these men have been to therapy. Um, a lot of therapists don't have time. A lot of people don't have money to pay therapists, but I think there's really value in, getting a space for men to talk about these things. And so I feel like I gave them a semblance of that, even though I'm not a licensed therapist.
Here's what's beautiful about what you did. Um, One, time is the only thing that we don't get back once it's gone. But when you are authentic, genuine, and to getting to the core of what issues are, where the system fell, how people can tell a story, academic sense, and both from a practical sense, being able to sit and to your point, like me and you, I don't have my other set on, but both you and I have 4 sets of eyes, some glasses, and our 2 eyes. So, I mean, I tell most people you should listen. We got one mouth, 2 eyes, 2 ears. We supposed to listen and hear twice as much as we talk. When we got the glasses, we might have to listen 4 times. Got the earpieces that helps us hear better. We can listen better. But I say that to say you could have went through your questions, not pivot, not dig deep enough to allow those interviewees to be able to share their story, take ownership of their voice, let go of some stuff that they might have been carrying well into their 40s and 50s. Because I'm sure you have. I've sat on panels with men who say they're advocates, and yet they still stuck in not going through the grieving process of what they experienced in their relationship with their father. And oftentimes, when we think researchers and those in the academic space, that they may not really know and understand, and these are folk at the program level, don't understand how just you doing that alone has created a space for somebody to see a little differently because of the questions you ask, because of I'm sure it's, you give the questions, but I know they've asked questions to you as a part of that process. And as a father, and your own lived experience lends credence to many things. So kudos to you for just offering a space to be able to let them let go of some pain, let go of some trauma, and be willing to embrace the healing differently just based on your questions, because it's going to cause people to think more, right? And you
Yeah.
talked about its implications to policy, right? How can um, everything you just said, a lot for like community organizations, barbershops, schools, fatherhood programs to look at the narrative that they're creating, but how can they actually add some different elements to help them expand on that? Like, I don't always have to get to my inputs, my outputs. That's going to get to
Right.
my outcomes. Like, it happens naturally when you create the right environment. Is all I'm saying. Um, and so what I would also ask is, right? We're talking about their own experience, but like, and I know this wasn't a part of your research, but just in your professional opinion, how would you say, or what would be your professional opinion of how this impacts romantic relationships and fatherhood if you didn't ask those questions, if they didn't go through that process to be able to have different perspectives?
No, I'm actually writing a bit about this now. So the main way I was interested in relationships was, um, I would ask men at some point in the interview, do you have to be married to the mom of your kid to be the dad you want to be? Um, and I asked that because, when you think about growing up in this, and so for a lot of the men, it wasn't that they were just growing up with their own absent father. A lot of them were in a house with multiple siblings whose dad was absent. So you had multiple absent fathers in one household. A lot of their friends didn't have their dad. And so when you think about that from a perspective of relationships, a lot of these men, it's not just that they're not seeing dads in the home, they're also not seeing dads operate as partners. Right. And so,
Mm-hmm.
to go back to the story about, my dad, I realized after, you know, we met, and I realized one thing too, just hearing the way he talked about my mom, I realized like I've never seen a healthy relationship. I really had no idea how relationships both like were healthy and lasted, right? And so when I would ask these men this question, they would almost all say no. They don't have to marry the mom of their kid to be the dad they want to be. And so I think that's telling that I think a lot of the men, and I want to make clear too, it's not that the men don't value marriage. A lot of them want to still get married. They think getting married is important, but they don't see getting married and becoming a dad as the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so, I'm writing about this, what I call this kind of a disassociation between fathering and partnering, because a lot of the men are valuing both of these roles, but they've never really seen them operating together, at least, and especially not in a healthy way. And so if they marry the mom of their kid, I think it's not like they don't want that to happen. But I think that we have to also think about what it means to promote healthy marriage for these men. I think that you have a lot who um, are operating from a standpoint that it's like, as long as I'm in my kid's life, whether or not married to their mom, that's still a good thing. And I don't think that's necessarily something we need to like preach against. But I think only giving men this message of marriage versus here's how to be a healthy co-parent. Because if you're gonna have kids with different women, at least the least you can do for that kid's sake is know how to operate in a healthy way with the mom of your kid. And I think we're doing a disservice when we only promote marriage versus also making sure we promote the value of co-parenting for a lot of folks who won't marry the mom of their kid. And that's a whole separate conversation about what men should or shouldn't value. But going by what men said, um, a lot of them operate in a way that it's like they may be a father three times before they find someone they want to marry. And for those men, we need to offer something more than just, hey, marry the mom of your kid. Here's some healthy ways in which to work with that mom, so you don't end up absent like your father was.
Love that. Love that. Um, wow. So let's say you had 10 minutes on a hill with policymakers. What would be your ask to them in terms of supporting fathers based on your results from your dissertation, based on your experience, based on not only your lived experience, but your professional experience?
Um, it goes back to what you just said about, it's not always about like, inputs and outputs, right? I think that um too often, promoting fatherhood always comes or is always aligned with, getting a job or paying your child support payments. It's something like financial, something, um, you know, to obtain, in the job market, what have you. Um, I think this work really um, exhibits the need to create a space for men to deal with a lot of things I don't think that we're just giving them time to deal with, right? Like the pain of the absent father isn't overcome by getting a job, right? The absence from your kids' lives isn't fixed by getting a job and sending child support payments, right? There's a lot of emotional turmoil and internalize, stuff that are impacting these men, generations upon generations, right? Like some of the men I interviewed, they were like the third generation of experiencing absence. Um, I don't think any of them would say, well, only if my father had a job, he would have been in my life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like it's not just as simple as an economic fix. I think we have to better appreciate the value of dealing with these kind of I don't want to say internal demons, but internal experiences that men have been carrying for a long time. And I think my work really illustrates the value of what happens when we give men the space to talk about something they don't normally talk about. Well, I think for one, we realize that absence is a much more complex beast than we've given it credit for. One that has caused us to demonize absent fathers and overlook the ones who are still very present in their kids' lives. I think it's also illuminated the need to really, kind of reconcile generations of men who are growing up hating their father, but trying to be better than the person they hate, not realizing that in some ways they're probably facing the same obstacles. Um, so I would just encourage policymakers to create a space for listening and not just seeking employment.
So here's I love that. Now I'm gonna ask you a question. Most people probably think they know it, but what is the role of the researcher? And I'm just gonna tie it into what you just said a minute ago.
I think I would say, from what I said with the interviews, right? Like my role as a researcher wasn't just to achieve my goals, right? It was to give the men space to deal with something that I'm passionate about, right? And that's dealing with this experience of absence. And so the reason I gave the men space to talk is because I was less concerned with me achieving my research goals and as concerned with them feeling humanized in the experience. And I think too often researchers kind of go in just trying to extract the data they need to answer a question. And not to say I didn't do the same thing in some instances, but I feel like I tried as much as I could to make the experience one that was humanizing for them. Right. A lot of the men left saying stuff like, I've never talked about this before. It felt good to get this off my chest. Or I remember one guy saying, like, yo, I've never thought about this question. I'm gonna go ask my dad. Right. Um, to create that space, I think research can do a better job of humanizing the people we're studying. I think researchers generally care a lot about the issues they're studying, but I think sometimes that comes at the cost of neglecting the people they're using to study the problems they're studying. And I
Mm-hmm.
tried to make sure that the people in my study felt valued the best I could.
And the other thing I love is it's almost like being an accountant, right? You're going to create opportunities to solve problems through that experience of asking the questions, right? So,
Yeah.
and to your point, when you do it right and do it from a space where you humanize the experience, you're able to help people to shift their lens, to see perspectives that they normally wouldn't have saw, right? And that leads to, my last question for you. How do we build a world where better than my father becomes stronger with my father, in your opinion?
I think one of the most, I think, critical experiences I had in my life, like I mentioned in the beginning, was, sitting down with my dad. And even though we don't talk now, and like I said, I think there's lots of things about him that are problematic, but I feel like, this work was really bred out of the fact that I appreciated that, he had a tough life. He had things that, made it as hard for him to be the person I needed and that my mom needed. And I think that I think we need to learn to hold both, right? That, the sins of my father doesn't have to mean that he can't be forgiven. And I think too often in doing better or stronger than, right, it's like we want to put him in the background versus working with that background, right? And either directly or indirectly, right? Like, I don't talk to my dad, but that experience has still been pivotal. Um, you know, I hope the men and I hope the stories I get from them show the value of recognizing that we're all part of like the cycle that we want to break. But if all we keep doing is hating the previous cycle, then we're going to keep repeating it. And self-hate gets us nowhere. And so I think that finding a way to better humanize, yeah, there's a thing that LeBron James released. His dad was absent, and he had this
Yep.
big thing he released on Father's Day. And I remember reading it, and there was just so much anger in it, right? And so much, upsetness about how his mom suffered and things like that. And I think that's valid. Um, but I think what does it mean though for the next generation that's in the same boat, right? Should their kids hate them the same way? And I think that one thing I would love to see as we think about how to get men to move forward is to help them in a healthy way look backwards. And that's what I think my research does is trying to say, let's look backwards and be a bit more critical in how we're interpreting the past to inform our future in a more healthy way.
Man. Doc Alyssa Changary, who's a clerk of court in Mecklenburg County, says that how you see people is how you serve people. And to your point, for me to be able to look back and see beyond just the barriers, just the shortcomings of people, and look at the other parts, listen to the stories. And as you lifted up in this example, LeBron, I would also lift up Ray Lewis and his 30 for 30 story. And
Mm,
it actually happened right in Charlotte, North Carolina, right?
mm,
His dad worked for the same agency I used to work for, which was Mecklenburg County government. And it was two generations of father absence.
mm,
And Ray was hurt. Ray was angry. And anger is normally a mass emotion because I'm angry because I'm disappointed. I'm
mm,
angry because I'm hurt. So it's always accompanied by another emotion. But I say that he was able to break that. Him and his father became best friends because of him willing to have a conversation, him hearing the story that he never heard, right?
mm,
He remember all those times he was left out there waiting on his dad. But once he talked to his dad and heard his dad's story, his dad was able to navigate through addiction and
mm,
overcome many of the challenges he had. So in that moment, they each was reciprocating a certain level of love and support to become best friends. So I love that 30 for 30 because it really shares what happens when we operate in the highest vibration in the universe, which is love, but also making sure we understand that we all fall short of, mistakes and the grace of the creator. And in that experience, if we're able to forgive, not forget, but forgive, so that we can move on, we're also lifting the other person up to have another opportunity to make some type of pivot, shift, or transformation. And whether they do it or not, we created the space for that to happen. And that's what your research does. And I can't say another word without saying two things. Um, my beloved brother not only is doing tremendous work in the scholarly space in the research world, but is a graduate of PFF's Mentoring Academy through MPCL with Dr. Jeff Johnson, and actually been doing some tremendous work with them. So I want to say I am grateful and humbled to have you on the Father's Haven today. I know the way you shared the information and talked about how you approach research and participants who give their time
mm.
for the research. This is how we supposed to show up in community. So I want to make sure in this platform, I'm actually giving you your roses while you standing. And you right, he was gonna get roses anyway because he's from Philly, but he's fire in the work he does. So how can they follow you? How can they support? And what do you need from the community?
Uh, I'm not the best at social media, but I always answer email. I think that the best way to support me is to read the work that I put out, and invite me to speak. I'm always looking for more ways to do more research, extend this work. I'm working on a book project currently titled "Am I My Absent Father?" And so it explores that the same thing we've been talking about, kind of men wrestling with who their father is and how to be better. So look for that in the next couple of years. But I'm always happy to just find ways to work with folks like yourself, right? How can I take this work and apply it? What does it look like? What does it look like in practice? And so folks that want to reach out, my email's out there. I'm on LinkedIn, and I respond to every message I get, as long as it's not in my spam. But reach out and just help me find ways we can work together and turn this work into practice.
Y'all heard it. Another great episode of the Father's Haven. Apply the principles, the information that was provided in here, and I need you to tap into Dr. Mathew Alemu and make sure you support everything that he's doing. Inside the notes of this particular podcast, you'll find all his contact information. Connect with him on LinkedIn. He'll get to you when he gets to you, but eventually he'll get there. He said he's not the best at it, but we're going to work on it. And I'll see y'all for the next one. Peace, blessings, and elevation. We will bring you inspiring stories, expert insight, and practical tools and information to support you. Stereotypes and embracing our authentic selves, we can pave the way for a brighter future for ourselves and our children. Power, heal, and support fathers and men on their journey. I'm your host, Kelly Little, a.k.a. The Village King. Welcome to the Father's Haven.